of all, a little bit about myself as well. So I work at the observatory and I lead the work on system thinking and anticipatory innovation. So everything connected to complexity, uncertainty, and transformative change. Today, our goal is to actually provide you an immersive masterclass into the concept of what mission-oriented innovation actually is. And today we're going to be joined by also the great professor Mariana Mazzucato. So you will also have the possibility to hear from 4 practitioners around the world on mission-oriented innovation change and listen to insights and challenges connected to doing this work in a mission-oriented way as well. So we're going to really immerse ourselves into kind of the framing of the missions and how to get started on mission-oriented innovations within your country context. We are joined today by over 150 experts and practitioners from around the world, from 36 different countries. This will also include OECD countries and also the MOIN network, Mission-Oriented Innovation Network at IIPP. Rowan later on will tell us a little bit about what the network is about and what their work entails. And our work doesn't stop here. So not everything connected to missions can be solved with a 3-hour workshop. So today we are actually looking into the kind of the fundamentals, the definitional issues of the missions, and talking around the challenges around doing mission-oriented innovation work also in the public sector and beyond. But on the 26th of January, we're going to take the findings of this workshop and also going to operationalize this work. So looking at in practice what we need to do to implement this change. So we all hope that you can also join us on the 26th of January, when we're going to work on the tools and methods of kind of contextual change that we can all get started around solving the complex challenges that we're facing. Some ground rules to begin with for the workshop itself. We are, of course, all questions are welcome on the Zoom chat. You can put your questions and comments there, and also maybe an introduction about where you're coming from and where are you joining us from today. The chat and also the sessions will be under Chatham House rules. So please, to talk about what we talked about during this workshop, but do not quote anybody in terms of their comments or questions by name. We are also recording the presentations, so recording the sessions where the speakers are talking about their work, but we're not recording in the breakout groups. So you can be as open in the discussions as you want to be. And of course, we will share the slides of this work after the workshop is done by email. So we'll get in touch with you soon. So we'll run through the welcome. We'll hear also from Mariana's team at UCL about how missions work, and from her herself, and later on the specific examples. And then we're going into breakout groups to thematically look at issues around evaluation and other topics. But first of all, I'm also going to say how the observatory itself is looking at mission-oriented innovation. So first and foremost, it's a great part of our innovation portfolio approach. So at the observatory, we look at the 4 different types of innovation, from missions and anticipation, adaptive innovation, and enhancement-oriented innovation. And all of these different types of innovation are needed. But of course, mission-oriented innovations are those that really help to solve the kind of urgent problems and complex challenges that public sector and also societies today are facing. So it's a very important part of innovation portfolios in government and beyond. So we're going to talk a little bit about the portfolio approaches later on as well. For now, I'm going to give it over to Rowan and Rainer from UCL to tell us a little bit about what their work is about and how the MOIN network works.
Thank you, Piret. I'm going to pass directly to Rainer for the first slide to tell us a little bit about IIPP. Can you move the slide on? Now, Rainer.
Yeah, thanks. some of the Zoom didn't allow me to unmute myself anymore. This is like a new function in Zoom discovered today, I think. So hello, everybody from Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. We're very happy to co-host this workshop with OECD OPSI, with whom we have been working around mission-oriented innovation for some time now, and will continue the next year as well, as Pirat already showed. So just to very quickly do an introduction to our institute. So we are at University College London. We are a very new institute. We're just 3 years old. But at the same time, I think it's really important to mention that we are a full academic department. So if you want to stick around with us for a year, for instance, rather than 3 hours, just you can enroll in our Master of Public Administration program. Admissions are open, or if you want to stick around even for 3 or 5 years, you can join our PhD program as well. So, so we do full research, PhD, education, MPA, and of course, what we are really trying to reinvent, if you will, the academic department in is how to do and work with policy makers and public organizations. So our focus is really on how do we do capitalism differently, and we think for that you need also different kinds of public organizations. This is, of course, what we are doing here today. So we are very much a practice-based, theorizing organization. We try to learn from organizations like yourselves. And of course, this is where our mission-oriented innovation network is really at the core of what we do. And this is where I give the floor to Rowan to talk more about this network, who it is, and what they do. Thank you.
Thank you, Rainer, and welcome everyone, and welcome especially all of the members of the MOIN network. We're delighted to actually host you in this gathering alongside other members of OECD countries. So this is a great blending of these two networks, and we're really pleased that so many MOIN members were able to join us. We have MOIN members in 80 organizations in over 25 countries, and it's really lovely to see that we have people from 36 countries here today, even people calling in from Australia and in Japan. So there are some people for whom it is the middle of the night. If you go to the next slide. The MOIN network has been growing and is really focused on how institutions at an institutional level, practitioners do mission-oriented innovation differently. Mission-oriented innovation is really a new approach to solving the biggest challenges society faces, from climate change to inequality. And what our founding director, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who you will hear from shortly, says, it requires a market-shaping framework more than the more traditional market-fixing one. And that's very much the work of the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network, is that we work with institutions both in a bilateral way, but also connected through events like these and through smaller group gatherings, where we learn and share and do this practice-based theorizing, understanding how missions can really work in practice. And there's been a huge amount of policy impact through IIPP, starting with the European Commission, where they have put the missions at the core of the ambitious €100 billion proposal in the mission-oriented research and innovation in the European Union. And I know many of you are guided by that particular framework. So we'll go to the next slide. And we have a very a broad framework for how we think about missions at IIPP. We call it the RAW framework. It means that we think about things in a very holistic way. We think about the routes and directions, how to use policy to set direction for change, but also importantly enable bottom-up experimentation. And we will hear from 4 MOIN network members later about how they are doing this and how they've set sort of infrastructure in place to do that. Organizations, it thinks about both how organizations need to have a learning infrastructure, but also take risks and build the capability and capacity to deliver on missions. And we'll talk about that a bit more in the breakout groups as well. Importantly, assessment, governance and evaluation have to be different in the course of running and leading missions. So we will also discuss how to evaluate public investments so that we can shape markets rather than just fixing markets. And really importantly, it's all about finance and capital and returns as well. So we have to think about how we share risks and rewards, because there is always a complex partnerships that enable missions to actually happen. So how to form the new deals between public and private sectors, socializing the risks and rewards is very much a key part of how to deliver missions. So we'll talk about all of these things in the breakout groups, but if you move to the next slide, we're going to do a quick woo clap, which I'm going to ask Pirat to do, which is sensing from the audience a little bit about where you are on your missions journey. So Pirit, passing back to you.
Excellent. So if you have your smartphone or smart device near you, or you can use your computer or Chrome browser, so just type in www.wooclap.com/missions2020. So take your phone and go to the website that we have then, and our team in the background is also posting the link in the chat, so it will be easy to also copy. And there, when you end up on the platform, we are asking you the question, how would you rank your expertise in missions? Are you new to the topic? You have knowledge about missions, but no practical experience? Knowledge and practical experience, or you are a mission expert? Well, as you can see, we have answers coming in, and you can see on top of the screen as well that the address is www.wooclap.com/missions2020. So great to see diversity in the room we have. And once you have chosen the answer, also push the button that submit. So submit the answer and we can get the answers in right away. So a couple of mission experts in the room. We're going to hopefully find out who those are in the course of the session. Quite a lot of people with knowledge and practical experience, but don't really feel that they have true mission expertise yet. And the most popular group, of course, knowledge, but no practical experience. As we have seen as well, that countries are getting started on missions, and there is a lot of interest into the topic of doing actually mission-oriented change in a different way. So I think that this is extremely indicative of the topic. And we also have great to see that there are new people interested and willing to learn more about the approach in the room as well. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to log in your answers. And do keep your smartphones on the same page. So when we get to the next question, then you can open the same browser link and the new question will appear. So great spread connected to that. Okay, everybody is now a master on WooClap. So when we come to the next question, then you can join in on the answers right away as well. I'm going to give it over to Rowan again to introduce Mariana, and who's going to give us a crash course into what mission-oriented innovation actually is and how to do missions in practice.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I'm delighted. She's a very busy woman, but she has made time for us this afternoon, and I'm delighted to introduce the director of IIPP, Mariana Mazzucato, who's professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at UCL's IIPP. She is winner of so many prizes that we can't really list them all, but she was named one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation by the New Republic, and one of the 50 most creative people in business in 2020 by Fast Company, and one of the 25 leaders shaping the future of capitalism by Wired. Her highly acclaimed book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myth, investigates the role of public organizations in playing the investor of first resort role in the history of technological change. Her 2018 book, The Value of Everything, really brings value theory back into the center of economics in order to reward value creation over value extraction. And she will have a book coming up next year, which really focuses far more deeply on mission economics. So I'm going to pass you now over to Mariana, and hopefully she will be able to share her screen and to take you through the concept of mission-oriented innovation. I can hear you, I can't see you.
Hi, yeah, you can't see me?
Yes, I can see you now.
It says I can't share the screen. It says host disabled, attendee screen sharing.
Okay, it should work now.
Let's see here. Yay. Okay. So hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you. I just had a crazy morning. I first spoke to Korea, had hundreds of people in the room, and then was just with the Palestine national authority around innovation. And that was fascinating, the kind of questions I got from that region around mission. So let me just find a way to do this. There we go. Rowan, can you confirm you can see the full screen?
I can see the full
Great.
screen.
Okay. So, you know, I set up IIPP 3 years ago, very much on the basis of what I'm about to talk about, which is that in order to have better policy, we actually need new thinking. It's impossible to do the usual way that academics work, is they write brilliant papers and at the end they might say, oh, here's the policy implications. And we're very much wed to actually speaking and working with policymakers at the beginning, right, ex ante, because so much of then the policy areas we think about, like how you bring purpose and missions to, say, industrial strategy, innovation policy, it's incredibly messy. And you end up learning a huge amount, and that has to come back to the theory. So that kind of feedback between theory and practice, we're very much wed to that. And that's also why the kind of people we've been hiring recently, we call them practice-based theoreticians. So again, you know, really taking practice seriously and bringing it back to the theory. And the reason we need new theory is that so much of the way that we think about the role of the state, the role of policy in you know, modern capitalism is actually very problematic. This notion that it's at best for fixing markets. And so the need for a better approach, which I call market shaping, market co-creating, was very much the sort of broad agenda around missions. And missions in some ways are just one of the many ways, the practical ways that we can implement this idea of market co-creation, public and private co-creating markets, and having purpose at the center of that process. And I often say to my friends in the policy making community, including the OECD, is that if you're comfortable with this, you got a problem. Because actually, you know, a lot of the way, for example, that finance ministries work, that we think, you know, how we think about budgets, how we think of the debt and the deficit has to be affected by this kind of thinking. And if not, it's just this little siloed, cute area where at best we apply it to innovation policy. So how do you bring it to the center of how, you know, public policy is thought about, for example, in the European Commission, outside of just the little area of innovation, to the center of the cabinet of how we're thinking about the Green Deal is central. And this is really where I want to begin, that this whole conversation that we're having with you guys today, with our MOIN network, is, you know, a fantastic conversation. It's about the direction of growth, and the concept about growth, not just having a rate, but a direction, is very much out there. We don't really have to push that point through. You know, ever since the financial crisis, it's been widely, you know, understood that we can't have growth for growth's sake. There's plenty of growth just before the crisis. It was just the wrong kind of growth. So how do we get growth that's more inclusive, more sustainable, less financialized, more investment and innovation driven, but especially that really reaches goals, right? That's goal oriented. We have the Sustainable Development Goals since 2015. They've been agreed on by every country that is part of the United Nations. And so, you know, what does that actually mean to walk the talk of sustainability in such a way that is really at the center of both how, you know, organizations are governed, and both public and private, but especially how they work together. This is really, I think, the challenge. And also, you know, we don't have to push through this need to also create change in business and within government also, because within the business community itself, and those of you who go to Davos now and then will know this, there's all this talk about stakeholder value, right? That business has sort of lost its way, went too much towards short-termism, maximizing, you know, share prices. This idea that already was, you know, written about 2 years ago in this famous letter that went viral by Larry Fink and BlackRock, that we needed more purpose within companies, investing more widely back into, you know, workers, communities, the planet, and, you know, really a message that was then repeated in terms of the need for long-termism by the Business Roundtable a year ago in a famous letter they wrote in the New York Times. So, you know, definitely a lot of talk, SDGs, ESGs, you know, are we getting any closer to actually changing our capitalist system? And I think the answer is to a large extent, sort of, but where we come into the picture is that it's not going to change actually, unless we have a fundamentally new framework for how we work together. So back to the ESG point, that's all about purpose within companies. We need to bring purpose to the center of how the system itself operates. And that's very much the key point about missions. No mission will ever be done with either just a public or private actor. It's very much about working together, but what does that mean? And, you know, starting with this point that this isn't just about fixing things when they go wrong, but actually creating it is very important, especially when we look at specific policies, because a mission-oriented innovation policy will have to then justify, different types of innovation investments, not just as fixing, say, a positive externality problem, right? Basic research, it creates great spillovers. That's why you have few, we don't have enough businesses investing in it. So the public sector corrects for that. That justification for public investment in innovation is not a good one. You're just filling the gap of something that someone else is not doing. So what does it mean to have an objective problem kind of oriented innovation system? You're gonna have to go beyond just fixing the public good problem. Similarly, the kind of financing maybe the SMEs will require in order to be part of a dynamic innovation ecosystem, framing it as just fixing, again, an asymmetric information problem. Yes, we do have asymmetric information, but we can't just patch our way, right, to building a better system. And, part of how I kind of theatrically talked about this in one of my first TED Talks with this great designed slide that someone did for me was saying, we have to also change literally the storytelling that we have about what public policy is for. So if we continue to pretend that all the color, literally the color, the creativity, the dynamism, the value creation is done in business, and the policy bit is about de-risking the risk takers, enabling, facilitating, all these words that aren't actually negative, but just kind of boring, that's part of the problem. So you're not de-risking, right? The policymaker is not de-risking Zuckerberg or the Elon Musks of the world, but actually sharing risks. And if you start talking about it that way, sharing risks and welcoming uncertainty, you also start thinking about the follow-up questions like, oh, if we're sharing risk, how do we share the rewards? Whereas if one is kind of boring and de-risking the other, again, it sets it up already in very problematic ways. And also all the investments we all know we require in our systems of innovation, whether it's the infrastructure, the education, the research and development system, framing it as just kind of the basics, which, through kind of leveling the playing field kind of investments, again, doesn't capture the real ambition behind it. And this is a wonderful quote I always put up from The Economist, because it really captures this problematic narrative. And I think MOIN and IIPP are just as much about the narrative, new framings and practices that are all part of this new storytelling. So the idea that somehow all the revolutionary stuff is in business and the government's there just to fix the basics, that's very much what we're trying to debunk. The next slide, apologies, is a bit self-promotional, but just to say that for me at least, the mission stuff has been kind of a slow accumulation of understanding, at least for myself. This notion of the entrepreneurial state being required to actually be an investor of first resort, not just the lender of last resort, and all the different institutions that are required across the innovation chain was very much at the heart of this concept of the entrepreneurial state I wrote about a decade ago. But then I started thinking a lot about how that had to be underpinned by a new approach to talking about value and wealth creation. And that really meant going to the heart of economic theory, how we talk about the creation of value in economics and making sure that we were debunking that along the way. And again, the kind of recent work on missions, which this whole MOIN network is about, I've been trying to more recently really think that through also very holistically, which is what does it mean to have, again, an outcomes-oriented, mission-oriented approach to policy making itself, not siloed within any one bit of it, whether it's industrial strategy or innovation. And what does that mean for, again, the big economic questions, as well as the very practical, the purpose-led approaches. So, the background issue is that this whole idea of market shaping, it's not just what we think should happen, it's what has happened. So, the big innovations that occurred from the early capitalist era actually could not have come about without both public and private. But if you actually look at the public interventions, they were really distributed across the whole innovation chain, the value chain, as much on the supply side as on the demand side, and often also really housed within certain types of entities, whether it was in some cases innovation agencies, public banks, procurement agencies, and really better understanding what kind of drives some of the organizational dynamic behind those organizations was very much the starting point. And the iPhone story, which was the kind of entrepreneurial state theatrical part, was very much about saying, look, there's two big points here. We wouldn't have any of the smart technology in our phones without public money. But on top of that, there was particular organizations, right? So internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, they came about through particular organizations like DARPA funding the internet, and what do we know about that? You know, and yes, that's talked about sometimes in the case study kind of way, but we don't really even embed it in any of our economic models. If we know that this kind of problem-oriented culture and, you know, willingness to take risks and to have a portfolio approach, all that kind of DARPA story is important, do we even have measures of understanding when it exists, when it doesn't, and especially what does it look like going forwards in terms of sharing the experiences of such organizations, sharing the experiences of stepping outside of this pure, just kind of market fixing box. And in fact, if you look at just the websites, right, like I'm not talking about hardcore economics here, of many of the organizations that one can think and talk about as mission oriented, you don't see any of that boring language when they're talking about themselves, right? It's very much that co-creation language affecting and creating new landscapes, new markets, not just fixing existing ones. And yet again, how do we codify that in terms of, you know, our ability to talk about economic growth and to steer economic growth and fostering that kind of market shaping and mission orientedness within these public actors, which we know have been so important. And so a lot of the work we've done in the Institute has been about saying, look, this is, you know, this problematic language is part of the problem. What is the new language that we actually require? So if it's not fixing, is it co-creating and co-shaping? What does that look like as a rigorous framework to then also measure whether you've succeeded or not? If it's not de-risking, what does it mean to welcome uncertainty and share risks and rewards? If it's not leveling, what does it mean to tilt the direction of growth, not by putting all your eggs in one basket, but really choosing that direction and then creating portfolios that really pick the willing, as one could argue. What does it mean for the kind of internal capabilities and capacities that you need? Because we've seen so much outsourcing of that capacity globally. And again, this issue of metrics. And so the missions approach really kind of begins with that challenge of, hey, let's, you know, talk differently and let's have a different approach that can really be inspired in some ways by one of the most challenging missions we've ever accomplished, which was the moon landing. And this isn't about copy and pasting, you know, what happened to go to the moon, because we all know that that was, you know, I don't want to say purely technological, but very different from the kind of SDG related missions. But it is important to pause a minute and to just admit that this was extremely hard. It required a huge amount of private sector, not just public sector, right? I've been going on about public, but everyone knows the moon landing was in fact very much a public mission, but there was lots of private sector effort. And what was interesting is how they worked together, literally how the procurement policy was designed, for example, by NASA to crowd in all sorts of different efforts, but also the incredible cross-sectoral amount of work that, you know, had to be done. It wasn't just aeronautics, lots of innovation and investment in materials, electronics, software was part of that story. And so the idea is, you know, start today, not with the Cold War, you know, idea, but these SDGs, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the 169 targets beneath them. What would it look like to have this kind of outcomes-oriented, really bold and ambitious strategy, which, you know, underlying each of the SDGs, but also nesting it really within local context. So the missions themselves are co-created and decided upon by the different types of participants involved, especially with some of our work on cities. We've experienced what that means, say, to bring citizen assemblies to the table. But, you know, starting with a challenge, transforming it into a mission that requires lots of different sectors, and then redesigning the tools on the ground to foster that bottom-up experimentation. These are just some examples that I wrote about in this report. This was the kind of key report that launched some of this mission thinking in Europe. It became sort of law, I guess you could say, because the Parliament and the Council voted on it. And in arguing for it, we used two examples, actually several examples, to show what it might look like. So if you take the climate change, SDG 14, transforming that into a very clear mission around carbon neutrality, by definition would require, you know, innovation, not just in renewable energy, but in the real estate, construction, mobility, social sectors, and all those different types of projects that would be crowded in. But they wouldn't happen on their own. There would have to be, again, that ability to catalyze and create additionality bottom up to co-create different solutions for these missions needs to be really embedded in the design of the tools themselves. You know, what is a mission? In the report, we talked about 5 key criteria. Again, that kind of bold, inspirational mission, which then does foster new thinking in terms of where future opportunities lie, but they have to be really clear, directed and targeted, be cross-disciplinary. This is, I think, very important for academia to remember. It's not just about the sciences, the hard sciences. You need humanities and social sciences helping to really also think about, inspirational ways also to engage with citizens, and cross-actor, public, private, third sector. But this point about doing all this in such a way that really then drives multiple bottom-up solutions is really the design question. How to implement missions. This was a second report that we wrote, very much beginning with this question of who decides and what does it mean to foster citizen engagement, but also in terms of the financing, because any pot of money won't necessarily be enough. How do you really leverage and create a multiplier effect by thinking through that kind of financing and crowding in issues? This is very important for Europe, where the actual innovation budget is not that high still relative to GDP. So if you have a mission-oriented approach, really thinking through the design of the tools to then crowd in other types of finance, that issues around flexibility, adaptability, accountability, and really focusing a lot on this issue of public sector capabilities that are required. The work we did with the UK government was very much around the industrial strategy side of things. Up until then, they had a list of sectors. They were thinking about aeronautics, automotive, life sciences, creative industries, and financial services. And we said, stop thinking about random lists of sectors, think about your key challenges. And then we helped set up this, or we organized a mission-oriented commission for the industrial strategy that helped to transform some of these broad challenges like the future of mobility into missions. So this is the example that we worked with, and it was very interesting when we added the word universally accessible travel to the future mobility mission. By definition, that required quite a bit of a bottom-up innovation in the area of disabilities, for example. But this was work done for 2 years with the government. We've also more recently been working at a very local level with Camden, part of London, where our own university is based, but which also sits on the land on top of which Google and Facebook rent out space. So they also are thinking about the tools like wealth funds and what would that look like for Camden. But this is an interesting one because the carbon neutrality mission for this particular part of London is going to be focused on 250 housing estates. So social housing throughout London, and actually involving citizens very much in that process of, being able also to have metrics that they themselves can monitor over time in terms of whether their own lives are improving or not. We worked with financial actors. So in Scotland, they were interested in setting up a public bank. We helped them do that and made sure that within the design of the bank itself, it was focused on some of Scotland's own ways that they've been thinking about the SDGs at the macroeconomic level. But in our heads, we were really also very wary of the fact that there are plenty of public banks out there, which unfortunately often become handout machines. I'm from Italy, and our own public bank, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, hasn't been as ambitious and catalytic it could have been in the past, because it didn't necessarily have goals and didn't necessarily see itself as being, again, that investor first resort that could put some conditionalities, for example, in place with the loans themselves. And so by having a goal-oriented bank, that means that the way that the public loans are being handed out can also create some conditionalities that those receiving those loans help steer the area into a new direction. This is what happened, for example, in Germany, where the KfW put some conditions attached to the loan it gave to the steel sector in recent years. This was 3 years ago. And so the repurpose, reuse, recycle innovations that steel in Germany had to implement weren't because they went to Davos and talked about purpose. It was because they had to in order just to access that loan from that mission-oriented bank. And we actually just last week with Olga, who I think is also on the call, wrote a report for the European Investment Bank funded by them on what would it look like to transform the EIB's loan generation system if it really is going to be a climate bank and a bank that's oriented around the circular economy. It's not going to be status quo thinking. The work in Italy has been interesting because, as you know, the European recovery scheme right now, unlike after the financial crisis, is not conditional on austerity, countries lowering their deficits, but actually investments being made around climate and digitalization. And so one of the, it's easy to come up with strategies. It's not so easy then to implement them. So a lot of the work we've been doing with Italy recently has been looking both at, what might, missions be at the high level in Italy, but especially what is the capacity that's required on the ground for changes, for example, in the way that public administration itself has been operating. And so really kind of getting some examples like the strategic use of public procurement, but also debates about what is public value within the Italian public service, the ways to use state-owned enterprises in a more dynamic way than they have been used in the past. These are all issues that we are working with the Italian government. And we actually just wrote a report, I think 2 weeks ago for the UK government around this issue of evaluation. And a lot of that was on the back of some work we did in a paper called The Economics of Change, which might be passed out to you as resources, where we looked at, again, what is the different evaluation techniques that you would need if you're implementing a market shaping approach. So not cost benefit analysis and net present value, but more dynamic types of metrics that actually capture, for example, the dynamic spillovers that happen along the way, right? In the same way that software benefited immensely along the way, getting to the moon, that's true actually of most missions, and yet we don't really know how to capture that. Let me just finish because I think time's up. This approach of roots, organizations, assessment, risks and rewards that Rowan talked about, if you want, there's a background paper on that from 2016, but really that last point of risks and rewards, I think is often the most difficult bit. It requires a lot of courage. And this really is about, again, changing the narrative. So if you're sharing risks, what does it look like to share the rewards? What does it look like to talk very openly about how we govern the innovation system in the public interest and not just private profit, in terms of the implications for IPR, intellectual property rights, or prices? That's the case for health innovation, which is often publicly financed, but then the prices don't reflect that. Or conditions attached, as I already mentioned, the conditionality, for example, of reinvesting profits back into the system instead of siphoning them out. That notion of purpose in the beginning could actually be embedded within the contracts themselves. And under this current moment of COVID recovery schemes, which, as you'll know, globally, it's a huge amount of money, 2 trillion in the US, 2 trillion in Europe, and so on, 1 trillion in Japan, it is actually a very interesting moment to bring these notions of public value, for example, into how we produce vaccines together. What does it mean, again, for patent pools and collective intelligence instead of just private profits? But also the conditionalities. You'll know that in France, for example, both Renault and Air France were forced to commit to lowering their carbon emissions as part of their own recovery funds received, or in Denmark, they had a very specific point about you can't use tax havens if you're going to get recovery funds from us. So this is the moment, I think, to be bringing this missions concept into a more uncomfortable ground than it has been when it was just siloed in innovation policy, because we have to bring it to the center of how public and private work together. And the way we talk about conditionalities is interesting, I think, as an example of that. And sometimes it also requires new institutions, like in Barcelona in Spain, the mayor Ada Colau, brought in hackers into the city government precisely into having a much more proactive governance of the data to benefit the public purpose, so public transport, for example, instead of always being intermediated by, say, the big tech companies. So that's just a really interesting experimental ground that people like Francesca Bria, who's part of MOIN, has really led on. And we also work closely with some parts of the world that actually have experience and a history of a stakeholder value approach, because they have cooperatives, right? So the Mondragon region of Spain, where some of us are working with the local government, 87,000 workers in the Mondragon cooperative, that whole region actually has a history and experience of engaging different value creation actors in negotiating the future. And so what does it look like to bring the cooperative model outside just of corporate governance into a regional transition for how workers, capital, government, academics kind of work together? And this is a very interesting thing. Sorry, I went way too long. So I will finish just with saying this is more important than ever in the COVID moment, but we're really thrilled to be working with many of you. I think one thing Rowan didn't mention is that with some of you, we've actually been doing deep dives, which means working with you over a 2-year period into that kind of organizational change that has to be confronted in terms of, again, what does it mean for budgets, for procurement, and for partnerships? And we're very keen to extend some of these deep dives. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Mariana. Now there've been some active questions in the chat while you were going. You definitely stimulated a lot of interest, and I think I would just follow up with what Mariana said there in terms of do go to the MOIN website or the IIPP website to go and look at some of the insights that are coming from these deep dives, and they span the whole world, looking at work in Latin America, looking at work in Italy and South Africa, and increasingly work in Asia as well. So there's a lot of really interesting insights that we're working on, and we would love to hear more about the work that you do. So to start bridging that gap, I'm going to pull out some of the questions and ask you to unmute and then speak to your question. I'm going to start actually with Ania Chowdhury, and I think you're in Bangladesh, Ania, is that correct? You had a great question. I'll read it if I can't see you at some point. But
Hi, Rowan, how are you?
Great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Can you hear me?
Yes, but we can hear you fine. Do you want to say your question as opposed to me reading it out for you?
Sure. I think, Mariana, thank you. That was an excellent presentation, very informative, insightful. Structure of government, and I work within the structure of Bangladeshi government, which is probably, in general, much more rigid than many other governments around the world. But at the same time, in the last 10, 12 years, we have tried to become more and more open and agile. And we're seeing many benefits of that. And we've tried to, there is this digital Bangladesh agenda that we coined about 13 years ago, and that has brought together a lot of mission-oriented initiatives. So around digitization, transformation within the government, simplification of service delivery. But what we have seen in general is that the structure within the government, any incentive structure, HR structure, procurement process, is anti-collaboration. So it's actually, people are incentivized to maintain the silo. They're disincentivized to actually break silo and work together across departments. So if collaboration is the underpinning, is the foundation of mission-oriented approach, then what is the reform that we have to take into account to move towards mission-oriented approach for innovation?
It's a great question. You know, I think part of it is the position of where the missions sit. So that's why I actually wrote an article for the Financial Times, I think it was August 9th, arguing that Europe had to take the missions out of just the innovation box and put it at the center of the economic growth box, which meant that ECFIN, you know, DG ECFIN, the finance ministries needed to talk about this stuff just as much as the innovation ministries, but also that, you know, the question of what does it mean for the Green Deal? And so the first thing is literally, where do they sit? And it's too easy to make them sit in these little siloed, you know, places like Ministry of the Environment or Innovation. And I do think bringing them to the center is key, and bringing them to literally how we think about the economy. So I spent quite a bit of time in the presentation talking about that we have the wrong growth models, and, you know, our econometric models don't include any of this for a reason, that unless we, you know, confront this issue of directionality of growth, and do so in such a way with tools and in our models themselves, the variables that do or do not have that kind of directional element, then again, we're going to continue to have the old economic models and at best have funky little policies on the side, but they don't speak one to the other. The experience, I mean, just on a more practical level, Mike Bracken, who I don't know if he'll be taking part of this MOIN bootcamp, but he was leading government digital services for the UK government. And it was very interesting, the experience they had based on what you just said, because he saw their role as setting up gov.uk precisely to create a platform so all the different departments could work together in a much more easy way also, right? So it's not just public-private, it's public-public. How do you get different parts of public administration to really collaborate and to think together? And he thought, hey, having actually a common web platform will help that also. Instead, you know, it wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. Each department continued to kind of work in their siloed approach, even though in theory they had this new technology that could have actually, you know, it's not technocentric, but it was also fostered in order to help make that happen easier, but wasn't done. And in fact, in some ways, I think the reason why a lot of the early GDS people ended up resigning from GDS was they were like, hold on, we weren't here just to create a website. We were here to change how government actually works, and to really foster that, you know, intergovernmental collaboration. So I think unless one talks about that as openly as you just did, it doesn't happen. And so had the GDS activity from the beginning been really explicit that we're doing this because we can't have proper government without having the different departments on the same platform, but also thinking, using the platform to foster more collaboration. It wasn't useful just to have that in their own heads and not say it explicitly. But the public-private collaboration bit, I mean, my view is we don't have metrics for that. So we talk about ESG, but we don't have the equivalent for, is the partnership symbiotic, mutualistic, or parasitic? And in the health sector, which I know a lot about, we have a very problematic way for setting up public-private partnerships. And the PFI schemes, the private financing initiatives in the health sector in the UK were extremely problematic. But it's one thing to critique it, it's another thing to build a better partnership. And I do think we need to take as seriously the metrics issue around the partnership, just like a biologist would never let you get away with the word ecosystem without saying, is it predator prey? Is it somebody, we need in the innovation community also to think through what does it look like to have a much more functional and not dysfunctional partnership.
Great.
So
second follow-up question, is that possible, Rowan, if you allow?
We're running a little bit over time and we have so many questions, but do put it into the chat and I will make sure that we come back to it, because I want to go to Andre Cordeiro in Brazil, who had also asked a question about risk. And I'm reckoning that we're not going to be able to get through all of the questions that have come through, but I will endeavor to ensure that we follow up with them. But Andre, do you want to chime in with your question?
Hello, are you listening to me?
Yes.
First and foremost, I would like to apologize for some typos. I am I am a little bit nervous. First time participating in this kind of event, so apologize. I can try, okay? Because I work with people management, have been working for a long time, and I am really grateful to see people with economic backgrounds questioning these assumptions, this narrative that everything good comes from one side, everything bad comes from the other. So to work within this environment is very challenging, because I would like to know if you could please share a bit about how can we help the public agents, especially decision makers, managers, people that supposedly are in power, because they are all the time feeling the weight of how they will be evaluated in the end. Can they really take risks? Really? We really incentive this or we punish this? I mean, I believe I'm talking more about Brazil, this is my source, but I've been seeing academic works all around the world speaking about this. So I'd like to please share a bit of light of how can we help these guys transform, how can we have change of behavior, and eventually the perception that society have regarding us. And COVID is here to kind of explode this matter for us. Please.
I know Cheryl Martin is here. I got a nice little private chat from her. And I must say, Cheryl's taught me a lot about this. Cheryl used to run ARPA-E, which is the sister of DARPA, but in the Department of Energy. And when I invited her to give a talk, I think it was back in 2014, Cheryl, around mission-oriented finance, I was still at Sussex at the time, I asked you that exact question in one of our panels. I said, Cheryl, you run ARPA-E and you're obviously taking huge risks. How do you do that, given that you're a public agency and public service isn't supposed to be a risk-taking service, but a stabilizing, And I remember she said, we actually measure our success in ARPA-E by how much risk we were willing to take, but also how much economy-wide impact our successes have. So both being really bold and going after things like battery storage, which isn't just a gadget, it has the potential to really transform a system, but recognizing that along the way you're going to screw up quite a lot is extremely important. And what you're saying, Andre, is true in so many countries, that you have venture capitalists being able to boast that, yeah, we failed, but then big success, Genentech, big success for Kleiner Perkins. Before that, they had all sorts of failures, but that's also because they are able to reap the rewards from the successes, right? So what does it mean to reap the rewards from the successes to counter also the failures along the way? That's not just a monetary issue. That's also that issue of conditionality. How do you structure a system So when you're experimenting and you know, learning and the trial and error that's occurring, you really are learning from that failure. That itself is part of your reward. But if you're not investing in-house in the capability to learn, if you're not a learning organization, because you haven't framed the civil service and public organizations as learning organizations, you might not even be making those investments that you require for the trial and error. So if you are failing, you're not actually learning from it. So I think there's three different issues. One is the narrative about value that I've been going on about for quite a bit of years. If you admit that you're a value creating public organization, of course you're going to have to fail. If you pretend you're just market fixing, it's not obvious why you would have to fail. So the first thing is the narrative, right? The co-creating, just like the private sector knows it has to, take risks and be bold if it's creating something. That's the narrative story. But also structuring the portfolio in such a way, whether it's through equity retention, whether it's how you govern the IPR that I mentioned before, whether it's conditionality on the reinvestment or the or on the prices, for example, if we're talking about certain types of areas like energy or medicines, that itself, how you govern that process, makes sure that even though you're taking risks, the successes have impact in the sense that the process itself is structured in such a way that has these, important, spillovers for the public sector. I mean, the obvious place where it doesn't work, as I mentioned, is IPR, where, how we've set it up actually doesn't even give the public sector its reward at the end of the patent, because we've allowed the patents to be so upstream, so wide, so strong that you actually don't even get diffusion once the patent is over, because we've really screwed up the process in the first place. And so that's why this whole notion of governing in the public interest is so important, because it's not just about whether the mission itself succeeds, like, did you get to the moon or not, but did you structure the process that could really foster a lot of these spillovers along the way. And so the learning also from the mistakes made.
I'm on mute. Excellent. Thank you so much, Mariana, for your time. We're not going to have time to go to all of the questions, but what we will do is endeavour to come back to you all with some insights gathered from this session. We also have a reflective session with Mariana, which you're very welcome to sign up to on the 15th of December, where she will be having an intimate conversation or fireside chat with some of the people we've been doing deep dives with. So with Georgia Gould from Camden Council, as she referred to, and also from some of our colleagues in Italy and in South Africa. So please do, I will post a link to that. Please do sign up for that if you'd like to carry on this conversation, which I know we could carry on all day. I always enjoy these sessions so much. But thank you so much, Mariana, for joining us for this session. I know you have 4 international sessions today. So it's been really fabulous to have you. And I apologize to those who didn't have the opportunity to get your question in, but we will move on to the next part of the agenda and then come back to some of the insights that Mariana had spoken about in the breakout groups later. So I will log my reaction and give you a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rowan, and thank you so much, Mariana. UCL and IIPP have done a fantastic job in kind of raising the importance of missions for Europe and all around the world, because we have actually problems to solve that need solutions. So these are things that do not wait. We are potentially the last generation to have any impact into climate change in terms of what it means to live on the planet Earth. So we are kind of we have many, many challenges that actually need mission-oriented approaches and ways of doing things. And we at the Observatory have been also starting to think about ways to make missions operational and accessible. So what type of agreements or framing of missions that you actually need to do to make missions possible, so that missions themselves start to have a logic unto themselves, that will start to change the infrastructure of government in its entirety based on the mission logic. Because missions do not happen on their own. They need solid and contextually aware methodology on how to actually make it happen. So one of the pictures and the canvases that you see is something that we tested out in Estonia by the highest level of leadership to define and frame missions and to start thinking about if we're going to make this vision work and we are going to play to win. So kind of having a mindset of no possible to lose to actually get to solve the problem and get loving the problem in its entirety, then how do we have to actually structure the way we work in a different way to get it done in its entirety as well? And this is also something that you need to be aware of, that you need both the kind of the top heavy actions from mission-oriented change, but you also need the missions to be creative and in a way simple enough and clear enough that they speak to your partners, because you also want to crowd in adaptive action, anticipatory action from your partners in its entirety. You also need to think about the innovation portfolios and how do you manage the portfolio of innovations that will actually allow you to kind of work in a mission-oriented way and get to the results in practice. So how do you manage those portfolios connected to the missions themselves? And not last but not least, about what type of leadership you need to have in place, because leaders also are emerged in the public sector from the perspective of kind of the rational needs, the needs that they need to be whispering to ministers, looking at opportunities or fixing day-to-day challenges. So how to also kind of flip the kind of the mission mindset on within leaders, or actually look at leaders or capacities within the public sector to actually get the missions done or get to that kind of mission logic within the public sector itself. So all of these are questions that we at the Observatory are working on, and our great colleague in the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, Philippe Roux, is also doing substantive research about what type of missions have emerged so far and what type of challenges are there to begin with. So Philippe, I'm going to give the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Pirette, and thank you all at OPSI and UCL, Mariana and her team, to give me that opportunity to present some of the work we do at OECD STI, Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate, on mission-oriented policy. What I will present today is a snapshot. I will over some of the results of a 2-year project that we've done under the authority of the Committee for Science and Technology Policy. What we've been doing is doing a deep dive into some of the policy landscapes of several countries to identify mission-oriented policy and try to understand better their challenges, their opportunities, their different forms, really get into the practical matters of mission-oriented policy. And to do that, of course, we first needed a definition. So we heard about definition, but here we have tried to formalize that, package that into some kind of functional and effective definition that you will see is very much compatible with everything you've heard so far during this workshop. So we define mission-oriented policy as a coordinated package of research and innovation policy measures, policy and regulatory measures. So this is not a fragmented measure that we usually find when we obey to this market fixing framework. Here, it's really a bundle of policy and regulatory measures. And of course, as we said today, they aim to address societal challenges, SDGs or other forms of formalization of societal challenges. They span several stages of the innovation cycle, from upstream from research downstream to a demonstration and even market launch. They use different instruments, supply side and demand side, top down and bottom up. They cross different policy fields, but also disciplines and sectors. And all that is targeted in very clear, ambitious and concrete goals to be achieved in a defined time frame. And if you try to open up a little bit more this black box of mission-oriented policy, we see that we have 3 main dimensions: strategic orientation, policy coordination, and policy implementation. And you see that this definition that I've just mentioned before, just presented before, is some kind of ideal type. When you look into through the policy landscapes of country, you see that basically no policy measures, no policy, mission-oriented policy measures really tick all boxes. If you can go back one, I know you're trying to hurry me up, but if you go, so what we've done is that we elaborated a bit more on this definition, and what we came up with is what we call the mission-oriented policy functional specification, where you see the list of requirements along those 3 dimensions that we would expect. Again, we used a very much Weberian approach, in terms of ideal type. And what we have, this is the core, and we have what we see in the countries are different policy initiatives that come closer or further from that definition along those 3 dimensions. Thank you. Now we can get to the, so we have also defined 4 main, we have tried to do some taxonomy, typology of mission-oriented policy. We came up with 4 main types of mission-oriented policy initiatives. First, we have this top-level overarching mission-oriented strategic framework, like the in Germany, the high-tech strategy 2025, the top sectors, mission-driven top sectors in Netherlands. Then we have those challenge-based approach that are more implemented at the level of agencies, sometimes ministry, which are much more focused on mainly more technological challenge. We have those thematic mission-oriented programs that really build on a long tradition of thematic programs that you can find everywhere, but they try to improve them in terms of coordination, strategic orientation, and implementation. And then you have a specific type, which you could say is a subcategory of maybe the two first one, which we call the delegated mission programs, where here it's very specific. They really delegate the authority of creating the missions to stakeholders. This is something that we would find to some degree in many mission-oriented policy, but here you have specific programs, especially in Sweden and in Finland, in Scandinavian country at large, where really there is a clear delegation of the authority and it's really a co-creation of the agenda. And we find that they have those 4 types have very different types of challenges. The overarching type, where they are confronted with problem of focus and integration, and they risk some kind of inflation and dilution of missions, in the sense that they are very broad encompassing initiatives. You have to enlist a lot of stakeholders, and the more you enlist stakeholders, the more you risk diluting the mission or creating more missions. There is here one of the many tensions of mission orientation, and of course transaction costs. If you look at the Dutch top sector policy, you will see that they try to mix different types of governance, mission governance, sectoral governance, and that creates a lot of committees and a lot of transaction costs. Then challenge-based program, here the main, and we are just present that one, the main issue is the articulation between the supply push and the demand side instruments. I know this is the theory in mission that you are trying to do that, but in practice, you need to share information, you need to make compatible different measures that are sometimes very hard on an administrative matter, sometimes dimensions, sometimes it's very, very complicated. One key issue also with these more challenge-based programs is really that you come up with mainly local solutions, very specific solutions. It's more like a project or sometimes a program. But then if you really want to have a transformational effect, then you need scale up and you need diffusion. And this is where some countries, as we will see, have a problem now and are stuck at that level and need to elevate the mission framework to the upper level of policymaking if you really want to have an impact. Thank you, Pierrette, for the next one. Now, if we look throughout the 3 dimensions that I mentioned before, and I try to summarize here some of the challenges that we have identified on strategic orientation. First, as we all know, and that has been well presented by Mariana, the idea is that with mission, you pick problems, not solutions. This is true, but this is true only to the extent that the problems that you are looking at are searching for technological and scientific solutions. That means that we haven't found many mission-oriented policy that really open up also to societal solutions that would require changing consumption behavior, production behaviors. Here, it's less. There are some cases, and again, some in Sweden, some of the experiences that are there are part of that, but there are not that many. Mainly, they remain in the technological and scientific, in the realm of scientific and technological solutions, for the good reason that they are mainly, right now, up to that stage, many of those mission-oriented policy are under the authority of STI, Science, Technology and Innovation authorities. So what they are looking for is scientific and technological solutions. Here, this is a very strong tension and a very important point. Very few initiatives have set the real missions. You remember those 5 criteria that Mariana presented? Well, not many of them have that. It's mainly mission areas. Some of them have no deadline and no timeline, or there are no clear targets. Some of them really look like mission washing, in the sense that it's industrial targeting put into some kind of mission robe. So sometimes it's not that clear. Something also very important in strategic orientation is the fact that often the mission creation moment is presented as a one-off stage where you create the mission and then you try to achieve it. That's not the way it works. If you look really very precisely at some of those mission-oriented policy, what you see is a very long and sequential process. So those 5 criteria that Mariana presented are in fact not met at the same time. And very often the real mission, you get it where at the end of this spectrum, of this process, when it comes to projects. So it's very much bottom-up steer. It's not like you have those top-down. That exists. You will find that in Japan, the moonshot, they have set those 7 goals, moonshot goals with clear targets and timelines, and then they will try to do it. But most of the time, this is not how it happens. Most of the time, it's very left to projects in the end to determine the targets and to determine what is really what we are really aiming to do. In terms of governance, many elaborated, multi-level, what we call nested, cross-ministerial, cross-agency governance structure that is great, that is really a very important added value of mission-oriented policy. But still, we don't know much about what is really happening into all those committees. At OECD, we often recommend to create a new committee, you know that. We add governance layers, but it doesn't solve all the problems. When you look into those committees, you see that there are strong tensions, power conflicts, and we would need to look a bit more into that. Still, now policy implementation, when we look at evaluation of mission-oriented policy, I'm sure you have read very nice articles saying that systemic policy needs systemic evaluation. Well, this is not what happens right now. We are not there. I'm not saying that this is not happen, that won't happen, but that hasn't happened. And for the moment, mission-oriented policy are very much relying on the traditional evaluation tools, and there is limited reflexivity on pilot experiments, and that hinders mission orientation scale up. Most of these mission-oriented policy are still pilots, and now we're coming to a very, very important pivotal moment where countries have to decide whether they get to the next stage, if they really want to, that this Mariana framework and agenda really takes place. And here you can see, and I thank you very much for your attention, and you can see where you can find more on this project. Thank you very much. Sorry if I've been a bit longer. Thank you, Pirette. Back to you.
Thank you, Philippe. There's a lot of work that the team in SCI has been doing in analyzing these different cases. So do log on to the MOIP Online Toolkit platform that you can see the link here. Maybe also our elves in the background can share the link in the chat. But of course, you're going to get the slides from the workshop as well, so you can get the links afterwards as well. And of course, looking forward to the final report of Philippe's work beginning of next year. So put it on your reading list for 2021. For now, I'm going to also ask from you about which mission challenges have most resonated with you. So if you've heard Mariana talk a little bit about kind of what is challenging, why institutions, or what is standing in the way of missions. You've talked Philippe, we've heard Philippe talking about quite a lot about what his analysis and his team analysis have shown in terms of mission challenges. But what are the challenges that in your practice are most resonating with you? So I'm asking again for you to log on to the WOOCLab site. So it's still www.wooclab.com/missions2020, and you can log in your vote. So just type in the vote, and we shall see creating ecosystems. So we have one coming forward, silos, power dynamics, ecosystems, and climate crisis in its entirety. So in our practice as well, what we have seen that people seem to be extremely busy in the public sector as well, and a lot of these existing practices of how to do things in terms of procurement or timelines that we're running against budgets that are split between silos or between ministries can actually break up the mission logic. So we're not able to act in a timely manner as well in consortia with other ministries or other agencies or actors. And we cannot be also sure that while we have thought about our portfolio or our mix of actions, that we can reach those things in time. Also, now we're coming in with a lot of different approaches. You can also put in many if it can vote several times in this round. So we are seeing digital transition, transformation, creating ecosystems as one of the challenges, risk-taking behavior, power dynamics again, capabilities, evaluational issues, stakeholder engagement, government capabilities, and others emerging. So quite a huge and very interesting set of different challenges, working with ecosystems as well. So we are also working together with different countries, in different countries, from Sweden to Latvia to others, on how to create that ecosystem mindset. So how to create visions for ecosystems around potential missions or future visions, and how to take them into practice. So what kind of structures, organizations, or even ways of acting do you need to have in place to make it possible? I'm going to give you another 15 minutes to log in, 15 seconds to log in your answers. And then we're going to hear about from the practice of mission-oriented innovation. So hearing from the mouths of people that have actually done it, so have lived through it in its entirety. So thank you so much for your answers. And we're going to, of course, analyze and look into the kind of the different resonating challenges later on as well. I'm going to give it over to Rowan to introduce the different cases and going into the kind of nitty-gritty of how to actually do missions in practice.
Excellent, thank you. Did we skip our first cup of tea? I think that's okay. We'll have a cup of tea after this one. We've got more content yet to come. And thank you. That was really exciting, seeing that that word cloud build into the complexity that is leading mission-oriented innovation. So I'm really looking forward to looking at that later. And one of the things to sort of remind you about today's bootcamp is it's both a kind of learning exercise for you guys, but also a harvesting exercise for us to learn more about these challenges so that we can build that to the next workshop, which will be focusing much more on tools. But we're going to give you some insights into that now with a kind of a suite of MOIN members who are doing this work in practice. And I'm really excited because many of them have really built in this sort of experimental frameworks or the learning that you need to do in order to make this more of a systemic piece of work. So building on Philippe's presentation there. We're going to start with Dan Hill, so I'm going to hand over to him. He has promised he's going to do 30 slides in 10 minutes, so we'll see how we go with that. And Dan is my colleague at IIPP, as well as being the Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, the Swedish innovation agency. He needs no further introduction from me. I will hand over to you, Dan.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to report from the front line, or at least the front line in Sweden anyway, it was really instructive following Philippe and who we talked with a bit, because he outlines how diverse all of the approaches are here. And I'm going to just show you what we've been up to in a couple of years, really, 18 months perhaps. And so our starting point is this quote from Madeleine Albright, actually. Of course, we work closely with Mariana and Rowan and all our colleagues at IIPP, but also building on a strong tradition of looking at the need for transformation in the public sector and government and around innovation. And so she laid it very clearly in a very different US administration to the one we currently have, about the need to actually transform the entire approach. So next slide, please, Brett. So what we did when we started the mission work was not actually building on some of what Philippe was saying, not actually starting with a sort of a top-down message from above or the Prime Minister saying, go in this direction, let's all run there. But we started with a very open process around a couple of key areas, pilot areas, if you like, mobility and food. And we went straight to the ground because Sweden is a very localized, distributed place. And so we ran these kind of what we call actors workshops. These are people running local transport authorities or people from companies, big or small, people from social sector as well, lots of public sector, actually very few academics and so-called experts. We went to the experts in everyday life, the experts trying to get things done on the ground, and got them to build system maps together. So next slide, please. Out of that came a few starting points, and we took immediately this kind of place-based approach. So we have these mission themes of healthy, sustainable food and healthy, sustainable mobility. But then we're looking for place-based environments, kind of system environments, because they force things to be systemic immediately. They force you to look at the context. You don't just lead with the technology. You can work with people and place very directly. Next one, please. Let me take one of those. So for instance, the street. If you look at the street, how we currently run it on the left-hand side there, the type is very small, so forgive me. But if you put the traffic department in charge of the street, you get traffic, basically. The clue is in the name. If you put gardeners in charge of the street, you'd get gardens. So we're saying, so how many things can we put into this complex system called the street, recognizing the street can produce biodiversity, conviviality, social life, as well as commerce. Technology is part of that, of course, but it's not really the driving point. So we're trying to understand what a street can do, or indeed what a school could do, a forest, a port, and so on. Those are our environment for missions. So next slide. So the mission that emerged was use the existing street. Use the existing streets in Sweden. They're everywhere. We've built most of them for the next 20 years or so over the last century. So how do we get them to produce healthy, sustainable, vibrant environments? So next slide. So just some numbers there, ignore the text really, but the blue text on the right gives you an idea. There's 40,000 kilometers of existing street. That's 600 square kilometers, 6 times the size of Paris. We've actually built more parking space per person than living space. So how would we use that as an innovation environment? Effectively point that at the problem. And that's far bigger than any innovation budget, to be clear. The annual budget for the city of Gothenburg is 10 times what the innovation agency at the national level is, what I work for. So use that existing investment, that existing system, and point at a different outcome. This is where directionality comes in, of course. So the directions are pretty much set, though, actually, either at the Sustainable Development Goals level, the global goals, or at the city level, or at the national level. We pretty much have our targets in place. The question is, how do you point the existing world at those targets? So now we're drilling down into the room here. We're getting, again, more stakeholders from the front line in the room at the same time, all working together. We call these system in the room workshops. Next slide, please. So then we work with Stockholm Stad in the first instance, the municipality, who found some streets for us to work with. These are 4 streets, but you can see they're completely dead, if I can put it like that. They're basically used as parking space, but these are right next to schools. So then what we did is we got the school kids to be the redesigners of these streets. And that's 6-year-olds then working as urban designers. They are the experts in these streets, to be honest, because those bits of street are dominated by the school. So we let them design it. Next slide, please. We also let the Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, have a go at this kind of exercise, and the Health Minister there before she was busy with other things. So I won't say who was better at this exercise, the school kids or the Prime Minister, but if you go to the next slide, please. These are the kind of outputs you get from that. So this is really now the nitty gritty of how do you exert change on the ground? And we're pulling multiple actors together here. School kids, but also tech companies, Ericsson, municipalities, all in the room at the same time. The National Transport Regulatory Authority, who can change the law around parking spaces, as well as school children. So next slide, please. Then we worked with ArcDes, the National Center for Architecture and Design, who commissioned a kit of parts that could build out in the streets. Next slide, please. Which becomes effectively turned into plans. Next slide, please. And here they are. So this is then the prototypes out. Now these prototypes are one-offs in a way, but they're, as with a prototype, they're built to scale. So these designed to fit into parking spaces. And again, I show the amount of space that we have to work with. A lot of space, effectively. We've got 40,000 kilometers of street like this. This begins us to change it directly. And the key thing is that the street itself is defining what happens here. So if the street says it wants bike parking, then fine. If it wants more greenery, if it wants playground equipment, if it wants cafe tables, these are things that you can do at a super local level. So we're really building a very participative environment around deciding what happens. There's tech in here. This is computer aided manufacturing of Swedish timber producing these things. So there's entirely new tech going on, as well as augmented reality, citizen participation toolkits. All of that's in there, but the output is greenery, social spaces. So here's a very complex system model, if you like, behind this. I won't bore you with the details, but if you go to the next slide, it'll zoom in a little bit, I think. This is just saying the value model this produces is quite diverse if you approach it again in this systemic way, so not from a siloed way. all of these little white bits here are bits of research that exist. Biodiversity researchers know if you change traffic noise, you get increased birdsong, which helps you recuperate from illnesses or increases your mental health. And those researchers are doing all of the work in that area. What's rarely brought together is that alongside the maintenance question, alongside the property development question, alongside the public health, the skills transformation, and so on. So these simple wooden interventions are unlocking all of that if you approach it in a systemic way, which is why it's interesting to think about scaling now, because the value this produces is far greater than the parking space that was previously there. That gives us a rationale for change and investment and scaling. So next slide. And just some quick feedback how these numbers really didn't work when translated to Google Slides, but the key numbers to look at there are the ones in the green circles. This is the feedback from residents and users, 70 to 74% positive, which is pretty good given we're taking parking space away, which usually I get death threats for. So this is a positive thing. And this is just a visualization of how the mission is working alongside other things, transforming the electricity grid, transforming the retail environment. We have a series of projects there aligned under that simple triangle there called the street. So this is the street working as an umbrella to align multiple projects in a portfolio. Next slide. Then I'll quickly whiz through this one. I think I've got a minute or so left. So school food, exactly the same principle. So this is from our food mission area. And this one is about how could we use the existing food system. So again, half of the meals served in Sweden every day through the public meal system. That's about 2 million meals a day. So 700,000 also in related public meals like aged care. That's 7 billion crowns a year, which again is twice the Innovation Agency's budget. So if I'm thinking about where is the funding or the investment to use for this kind of thing, can we take the existing budget from the school food system and instead of orienting it around cost and hygiene, orient it around sustainability and health and regenerative agriculture and business, as well as cost and hygiene. So this is a new recipe for school food that says in Swedish. Next slide, please. And again, we built a system map here. We did this a lot more rigorously, including probably 300 to 400 different organizations working through in these co-creation sessions. We've now started producing media about this online. So you'll see some videos out there about turning unhappy kids into happy kids, basically, and changing curriculum along the way. And this is now live procurement. Again, this is with Livsmedelsverket, which is the food agency, and Vinnova working together, which is relatively unusual, I would say, on a call for municipalities to now do prototypes around school food. So 4 municipalities are going to get picked in the next month or so. Next slide. So again, there's multiple projects aligned under one mission, school food, which is part of a bigger mission involving retail and farming and new types of food to transform the food system. So finally, I'll just sum up. So it's direction led, but many of those directions exist, but we still need to point things in those directions. You build in participation right from the start, so to co-create what things are. Place-based innovation unlocks the systems, actually, because they are systemic. They're the most powerful way. Ignore sectors. They're just a silo. They think about systems like places. Use the existing value, the embedded systems that are there, and use technology in the context of people and place. Multiple people come together, private, public, third. Prototypes are a great way of getting understanding out and building political capital as you go. So don't start with political capital, that's really hard, but build it through evidence gathered from the ground, and that enables you to scale to a national mission after starting local. Continuous engagement is required to make this happen, by the way, not fire and forget. And there's a platform strategy underpinning it, which I didn't go into, but basically is aligning the entire system around these prototypes. And finally, just a note on how it's changed how we work as the agency. We're now very clear that we're the sort of cement between the bricks here, working to build collaboration, to build networks of people that can get the missions done. So that's our particular role as an agency. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Oh, forgot one last quote from a systems theorist. Small islands of coherence have the potential to change the whole system. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for being that small island of coherence amid so much. Just thinking of that word cloud as that complexity, bringing some some coherence to that. We're going to do the Q&A later in the after all of our lightning talks. So what we'll do is store up the questions, and again I'll come to those who put them in the chat along the way. But we're going to move quite quickly on to Jordi Garcia, who is from ENISA, the National Innovation Agency in Spain. He's going to take us through the perspectives. We've broadly looked at them from three different perspectives. From Jordi, we're going to look at the perspective of the funder. From Kirsten and Hannah, we're going to look at from the perspective of the coordination, and from Sharad in London, we're going to look at from the perspective of the implementer. There are complexities in all of that, so they all play all of these roles as well in some way. So I will pass over directly to Jordi, if you're ready, to do your presentation.
Hello, buenas tardes, good afternoon. Thank you, OPSI, OECD, and also IIPP, and congratulations to Dan Hill, because it's a very top presentation. I think it's a good example for all of us. Okay, ENISA is depends 100% of the Ministry of Industry of Spain, and we tried 20 years ago. We start giving participative loans, so financing SME, innovative SME, and startups. So we have the experience, and we have been inside 6,000 more innovative companies in Spain. This is important because when we decided to put direction to missions 2 years ago, we started with a very wide experience and knowledge about all the sectors and the transformations of each of them. We have decided in left-hand side, you can see 4 pillars. So focus, industry, gender equality, territorial balance, and impact investment. In that last one is where we determine or decide, choose the 4 missions. It's sustainable mobility, so redesign mobility, as others, as you have seen. Access, universal access to housing, the new edification construction. Secure health, so when you take care of yourself, and also when you take care of the others, the 2 aspects of health. And then the rural agri-food activation. So we have in Spain a lot of territory that is being despopulated. There's less people each day. At the same time, this is where the agriculture and the agri-food has its roots. So it's the 4th mission. So this was the last part of, sorry, if you can go before the prior. After 2 years of thinking, talking with the ecosystem, with actors, with startups about these 4 missions, now we have the opportunity in the next 3 years to use the recovery plan, the European Recovery Plan funds to implement this effectively. No? And the focus for ENISA, and this is the bottom right bullet points, are the decisions that we have chosen, we have taken, because we are in the industry and SME policy. No? The first is that mission is not only for big corps, it's also for entrepreneurs and innovative SME. They are the ones being 100% disruptive. The big corps are not 100%, of course. We focus on industrial and business perspective more than science and basic R&D. It's also important, the both are important, but usually I think, in my opinion, usually the countries are more willing to push the R&D, and the industrial and business perspective is not so much taken into account. No? So our focus is that. The third is bottom-up discovery process. We also think that top-down planified decision is important, but we are more coordinating the conversation from the bottom-up discovery process, no? And then decide after listening to all. No? And the fourth is the local entrepreneurship ecosystem network. So the national or global value chains, I think that they are the agents who will change our lifestyle and products and services. But the local entrepreneurship ecosystem network, so the local nodes are crucial at the same time. So this is our approach. Now, yes, the next slide. I will show how we organize these missions that we have named tracking projects program. We have decided these 4 tracking strategies, the 4 missions. Here there will be a manager or a team and a business advisor council, and then each tracking strategy will have 2-3 challenges. So it's like in the Vinnova case, 3 or 4 sub missions or parts of the mission, no? The components. And in each of these challenge will have different multiple solutions to the same challenge. And then we will give them some time to prepare the plan, linking different local nodes, as I said. No? And then some of them will be rejected and some of them will be transformed to PPP, so public-private partnerships. And during 3, 4, 5 years, we'll have these objectives and their product or services solutions put it into reality. And the next slide, for example, for this tracking strategy number 3, that is redesigning mobility, the metrics would be something like this. This is an example, it's not the real definitive final one. Increase sustainability mobility in urban areas to 80% in 4 or 5 years, and reduce aggregate mobility by 40% without losing quality of life, work, and services. And in this case, for example, it could be discovered these 3 challenges. That is, for one side, optimal logistics and distribution with collaborative data and systems. Another that could be urban redesign for closer and remote access to the needs of the new lifestyle. And the third could be design and manufacture of viable clean vehicles. No? Each of these 3 challenges have different solutions. Yeah? And here you can see some of them. And each one of them has concerned sectors. Also, here is not in the slide, but SDG. We have decided 4 crucial SDG addressed with each one of the challenges. Key agents, especially we have 100 top startups changing this line, with solutions with the challenge. This is inside ENISA, so we have the information very close. And then local entrepreneurship ecosystems. So Barcelona is pushing to change the style, the mobility style with urbanization and with new kind of vehicles. So Barcelona can share this mission with Malaga and with Bilbao and with Madrid, or also with some other region or local node in France or in Italy or so construct this network in Spain and also in the European Union. No? So this would be something like an example. And to the final slide, these are our next or current challenges. The first is that, as we see, our approach is only a little part of the puzzle, and we have to work with other ministries and other entities in the public and the private, and this is very difficult, but this is the way, and we are investing in that. The second thing is assure good impact metrics. In the industry ministry, we are not the ones putting the metrics, the KPI. It has to be the experts or other ministries. And this November, we have done some workshops with all these representatives of the ecosystem. And the third one is do not die in the attempt against bureaucracy and all administrative instruments. As you say, changing the policy means that we have to change also the culture and the processes. No? And here there is another opportunity because the European Recovery Plan is also a reform plan. So we are on the way to change this administrative structure and rules to adapt to this new policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordi. I think that before we move on to the next coordination perspective, I do think I've had a small plea in the private chat for a quick comfort break. So I think that I should allow anyone who wants to just quickly breathe and maybe get a glass of water, a 3-minute break to just absorb what you've just taken in, and also please, and as we are all in plenary, do join me in thanking Jordi and Dan for those excellent presentations. Those were really, really excellent and deep case studies. So giving you a bit of a moment for cogitation and processing of that before we go straight in for another 2 case studies. I'm going to suggest that we turn the music on, if that's all right, Pira. I don't know if that's easy. If that's hard, don't worry. And give you 3 minutes to go and get a cup of tea or a glass of water. And then we come back here at what will be your 14:42, if that works. It's a bit specific, but and then we will move on. I think it will just give everyone a little bit of a moment to breathe. Oh, thank you, Pirat. The music is on. So 3 minutes, you have 3 minutes.
This morning during my presentation,
Okay, we're back in the room. Back in the room. Thank you, Piret, for the musical interlude. I think we will try and claw back some of the time, but I also don't want to not give you the break time to be able to breathe between these sessions, because there's a lot that we're trying to do in this meeting. But I am really excited now, if you want to share the slides again, Piret, to pass over to our next lightning case study, which I believe is from Hannah and Kirsten from Health Holland, and to talk a little bit about what it is to coordinate missions. So Kirsten and Hannah, can you join us?
Thank you, Rowan, for the introduction and for the invitation here to speak with you about the mission-driven innovation policy in the Netherlands. My name is Hannah Groen. I work as a strategy advisor at Health Holland. And after the first 5 slides, Kirsten van Spronsen will continue about implementation and coordination of implementation. Next slide, please. Health Holland is the organization in the Netherlands that is coordinating the execution of the missions within the societal team Health and Care. But we certainly do not realize these missions alone. There are a lot of public and private stakeholders involved. Next slide. And to give you briefly a bit of context, our cabinet adopted the mission-driven innovation policy in 2020, focusing on 4 societal themes displayed here: energy transition and sustainability, agriculture, water and food, and safety. And our Ministry of Economic Affairs is the process owner of this policy. And when we dive in focusing on health and care, we have 97 partners that committed in kind and cash. Over 1 billion is allocated to the missions of health and care in 2020. And we have a governance model of the 24 core partners on this theme. Next slide. The central mission of health and care focused on living longer in good health for Dutch citizens, and most important, decreasing health inequalities. Not an easy job to do. And the central mission is supported by 4 other missions that are really connected to one another. Lifestyle and environment, availability of care, people with chronic diseases and people with dementia. And Kirsten will dive into the 4th mission in 1 minute. Next slide. But we would like to emphasize that in the Netherlands, we already work for quite some time very strongly together in a triple helix structure with researchers, entrepreneurs, and government in so-called public-private partnerships. But in this mission-driven policy, throughout the whole innovation chain, citizens are involved, and we do speak in this whole traject of a quadruple helix structure. Next slide. Kirsten will continue. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Fantastic. Thanks. Yeah, we try to really focus on in this presentation on the 4th mission, the people with dementia and the quality of life, increasing that. And by focusing that, we have to consider that we are talking about a big transformation, and then we have to take into account that we have to have a new narrative. Next slide, please. And one of the first chapters in that new narrative is co-creation. Talking about that a lot right now, and we're doing that with the quadruple helix, as Hannah was just talking about. And that's really working with the people where it's all about. That's working at the place where the sense of urgency is really the highest, with those, next slide please, who are willing. And in order to co-create, we have to facilitate and create those connections. That's what we do as an organization. Because by facilitating those connections, we really, they understand each other's urgencies, each other's worlds even more. That's on a local scale, but that's also, and maybe even more, on between the local and the national scale, so the local initiatives and the national institutes. And the model on the next slide illustrates the needs for those connections. It's a multi-level perspective, and it describes the process. Can you do the next slide already? It describes the process of the sustainable transition. And the starting point, okay, this is still an old figure, but never mind. The starting point, the upper layer, you see the landscape layer, it's a situation we're now dealing in. Well, and you see obviously what we're talking about, but not only that, it's also a growing amount of people with dementia. The fourth mission we're now talking about. And the second layer is referring to the infrastructure. So the system we always talk about, you know, the healthcare, insurance, the hospitals. The third layer refers to the innovative ideas of the people who really feel the sense of urgency, who really know the needs and know the purpose. And those solutions of that people always meet the needs, but not always fit into the system, and therefore are most of the time not automatically structurally implemented. Next slide, please. So what we decided in our role as a coordinator of the missions is to simply swap it around. In the field labs, which is one of our instruments to implement the missions, the initiatives that really meet the needs are the starting point. Are the starting point to grow in a different direction. And a perfect example, next slide please, is Tante Louise. It's a Dutch name of a healthcare organization for people also with dementia. And what they did is, one, they facilitated connections by simply inviting the whole village to share their dream. And second of all, they started co-creation by asking everyone in the room, like, okay, how would you like to contribute to this dream? And we're talking about, well, I mean, the bakery in the corner and the neighbors and the municipality, but also research institutes and the bigger companies. And next slide, please. The result was much better than they could ever have dreamed of, because there's now freedom for all residents enabled by technology in a co-creation community. And the process now repeats itself because all the people also with dementia walking freely around a village, which is, as you know, not very normal in every stage of dementia, now it's facilitating again and again those connections. And the co-creation process starts itself again. Next slide, please. And this starting point is our beginning for our monitoring. So it's a vision of a world where missions are already accomplished, as you can see now, a very, very small part of. And this vision is designed with the experts of the quadruple helix on the local level, on the regional level, on the national level. And with them, with that whole coalition, it's also monitored. What we're doing all together to achieve, to accomplish those missions. And next slide, please. Whereas we now do that on a local and a regional and national level, why not broaden our horizon even more and do this with you on an international scope? So let's join our forces together. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. And you can always get in touch with us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hannah and Kirsten, and for whipping through what is such a complex strategy. And what I'm delighted about seeing these mission in action case studies is that they are really talking to all different kinds of missions. So it's really interesting to see a public health mission, and particularly a dementia featured within it. So really thinking about what does it mean to co-create with different members of the public was really interesting there. I'm now going to pass over to Sharad, who is going to talk about something completely different, really focusing on a mission that brings out the discipline of engineering. So working with the Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK and deploying the Newton Fund, which is a government-focused innovation fund, and setting up what he will explain to you, Engineering X, which is the mission-oriented organization that is focusing on how engineering can enable particular missions. I'll pass over to you, Sharad.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rowan. Firstly, thanks to yourselves at IIPP for inviting me along. It's really a pleasure to be here. Hard acts to follow after all those fantastic presentations, but I'll do my best. My name is Sharad Sharma. As Rowan mentioned, I've been leading the development of Engineering X, which is an initiative of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Lloyd's Register Foundation. So next slide, please. So this is our tagline, bringing global experts together to engineer change. I'll go through the next slide, please. And essentially, so we are a bit different to what's been presented, or the perspectives that have been sort of showcased before. We aren't a public funding agency, we're a national academy. We have engineering expertise within our fellowship, so 1,600 of the UK's best engineers and the world's best engineers sit in that fellowship from academia and industry. And basically our role is to foster that excellence and to drive it towards meeting societal sort of ambitions. Sustainable society and an inclusive economy are the Academy's ambitions. And Engineering X is basically our attempt at trying to sort of globalize or use our vast global networks to tackle global grand challenges. So over the past 5-6 years, through principally UK development funding, we've grown a really large cadre of 1,000+ sort of innovators that we've supported through training exercises, universities who are now collaborating with local stakeholders, about 1,000 organizations supported through grants to work on development challenges. So bottom-up programming, mainly in low and middle income countries, and trying to use that network and galvanize that network towards addressing certain challenges. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of distinctive role that we play. Obviously, Engineering X, engineering community must play a distinctive, have a distinctive contribution to make within the challenge that we're addressing. We require that the mission or the challenge that we want to address has this sort of complex and global character, requiring collaboration across geographies, sectors, disciplines. We're not so much on the sort of big research and innovation funding side, but we are about sort of taking existing knowledge, existing practices, and diffusing that and spreading that knowledge to where it's most needed as well. And of course, where there's sort of targeted research and innovation solutions that are needed, and that can have high impact, we're open to that, but we're not the kind of multi-million-pound research and innovation funders supporting deep R&D collaborations. Next slide, please. And this is the way we organize ourselves. So in the missions that we do choose to undertake, we want to have systemic impact and we want deep engagement with diverse communities. Those are our sort of goals. And then we do those through, implement our missions through 3 means: evidence and insights, trying to understand the character and the nature, the scale of the issue globally, grants and awards to sort of support people and organizations to do something about it, and then ensuring that we sort of build that community and engage with a broad set of stakeholders as well, to secure their buy-in and listen to their voices whilst we're sort of designing and implementing the missions too. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, please, I'll talk through. So we currently have 5 sets of, a set of 5 missions. Transforming systems through partnership, which looks to build sort of cross-sector engineering partnerships, universities working with local government, businesses, entrepreneurs, and communities to tackle local SDG challenges. Safer complex systems, which is trying to improve the safety of increasingly complex engineered and non-engineered systems, and improve their sort of reliability and resilience as well. Engineering skills where they're most needed, looking mainly in low middle income countries to build engineering capacity for the development, maintenance and operation of critical infrastructure, but also so we can deploy emerging technologies there to meet local challenges. And then a recent one around pandemic preparedness as well. Next slide, please. But the fifth mission that I was going to sort of deep dive into was our one around sort of safer end of engineered life, which is looking to support safer disposal and decommissioning of engineered artifacts at the end of their life. So be it medical devices, electronic devices, vehicles, or indeed ships and offshore structures, which is what we've sort of kicked off at. All these things do end up somewhere, and what happens to them, where do they end up firstly, and what happens to them at the end of their life is often that the risk of doing the dangerous work of disposing and breaking these things apart is left to the places which are least capable of managing them. And so the issue that we're trying to tackle is to improve the safety with which we do that. And so we've undertaken a global review on safer end of engineered life that's about to come out, and it's pointing to open burning of waste, of engineered waste being the sort of most significant safety issue globally that's occurring. We use projects and grant funding, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And we obviously convene workshops, and we have one on open burning happening early next year. Next slide, please. So in terms of mission design, I just wanted to sort of touch on this, and it's kind of a deliberately amateur portrayal, because this is what we started out at. And, you know, I think you've seen what I wanted to sort of convey with this slide is that, you know, the framework for us was exceptionally helpful in navigating uncertainty. We didn't have, you know, we have engineering expertise, mostly based in the UK, top global technical experts on their specific field. For this mission, we have a geotechnical engineer specialist in soil compaction around infrastructure sites and railways. But with a huge passion for the environment and environmental engineering, but not necessarily the knowledge of how all this stuff plays out globally in very messy situations. And so with what the framework allowed us to do was kind of put it all on a map, allow us to sort of understand, okay, what are the types of stakeholders that we need to engage with to improve our understanding of the issue? And then how do we, you know, because it's so broad as well, there, as I just mentioned, everything from ships to medical to electronic, these are completely different sectors, even within the sectors themselves. So many different types of device and types of problems as well. So we're really looking at quite broad issues. How do we structure it so that we feel, you know, even as a management tool for ourselves, try to do something about it which is meaningful, with the little resources that we have and the vast network as well. So that's really what I was trying to sort of get across. I was really excited to see, I think in the OECD presentation earlier on, around the design of the canvas, the mission design canvas. And I think I really do want to sort of portray with this slide and with the use of that tool that you don't need to have all the answers at the beginning. You don't need to have all the information. You know, put it out there, put it on a deck, you know, use that canvas to try and sketch out what a mission might look like, and then you can learn and adapt on the way. So if I can get to the next slide, please. And I think this is where sort of Rowan, you asked me to sort of come in and, you know, try to give a voice from the ground on actually implementation and adaptation of missions. So as I said, we kicked off with a broad understanding of the issues. Specifically in this slide, I'll be talking about our work in offshore structures and ships. So 90% of the world's ships and offshore structures land up in beaches in South Asia and are disposed and dismantled, oftentimes, mostly in incredibly unsafe ways, causing hazards to local populations and, of course, environmental contamination too. So what we did at the beginning was try to convene a workshop, a global workshop in London, put the system in a room. You would have heard that phrase quite a bit over the course of the few presentations, but all the way from workers' rights advocates, trade union organizations in South Asia, policymakers, regulators, oil and gas majors, BP, Shell, along the way, academic groups looking at naval architecture to sort of ship ship operations as well. Put them in the room and try to build that sort of collective agreement and collective intelligence as to what is the issue here, how does it play out in all these different sort of local situations, how do they join up, which is where you see that kind of the network map there that we asked them to create, and what can we do about it. And I think what was really interesting and important in building that workshop and putting that system in the room is really leveraging the networks of networks. Not any one person knows everything, but they can put you in touch with somebody, and so and then again, and trying to build your own knowledge of the situation and be relatively open and exploratory in the way that you approach conversations, and always ask, is there somebody else we should be speaking to? Very time intensive. It does require a lot, but at the end of the day, you do benefit from that. So following that workshop, and it was following that workshop, we developed a funding program for collaboration based upon our knowledge that we got from convening that meeting. And then we put in a sort of two-stage review process. The first stage be asking that community that we convened to come and present their proposals. We mainly asked them to collaborate amongst each other, but we allowed them to also connect in when they went back home with local stakeholders. And then from the first stage, of course, we got the proposals, we gave content feedback, but where we saw there were projects that were either aligned, we asked them to get in touch with each other, or in fact, where there were often leads in one project, which could then be sort of co-investigators of another, or co-leads or participants, and really try to build that thread through the portfolio of the 6 projects that we ended up funding. And the funding is such that we give, just the last slide, I'll try to be quick. In terms of the annual review process that we have for the funding, builds on to the last point there. We're constantly sort of doing outreach ourselves at the mission level or the program level, but also the participants themselves to sort of crowd in stakeholders into this area. And so the annual review process of the funding allows us to almost plug in those stakeholders into the existing funding and ask the projects, if they can, to sort of build in new stakeholders and those new collaborations into existing projects, or in fact, if they felt like they wanted to adapt further, that process allows them to do that, and really to try to generate that coalition of people globally acting in this space to try and affect real change across the industry. Next slide, please. So as I said, humble learnings from our side. It's incredibly helpful navigating its uncertainty, the framework, and encouraging exploration. It can be uncomfortable. It's not easy, going from a sort of defined process to something that's quite so open and that can change with any new conversation that you have. But I think it's rewarding at the end of the day. Linked into that, don't nail down on a program or solution too early on. It's far too easy to say, oh, we've got 10 million pounds, let's give 10 grants, $1 million each and then, expect things to happen. That's not really how, if you are trying to address and build a project across a complex system, which is touching at different leverage points, you won't get that from the easy way of doing things. It does take a lot of understanding from your part and building that capability within yourselves too. And it requires you to be very inclusive in the community you build, listen to underrepresented voices, especially these people who don't normally have a say in yourselves field policy making. I think it is really important, not just in terms of the voice, but also, as I mentioned earlier, we have another mission on safer complex systems. Without listening to underrepresented voices, you really risk causing quite grave safety issues on certain people as well. So it's really important to get their perspectives to mitigate against unintended consequences. Don't duplicate, collaborate when you're scoping your missions and the funding programs, assessing who else is out there. I think, as Dan brought up in his presentation, not everything's about funding. There's existing assets, if you will, and you'll be able to leverage those if you think quite creatively too. So, and lastly, I just wanted to say, remember what makes collaborations work. And it's the next slide, please. It's all about the people, and you've got to really think about what kinds of relationships you want to create. So in the word cloud, it was so interesting to see, ecosystems, and I think stakeholders, silos. These are all about creating relationships across, which break those silos, which create those ecosystems, get some knowledge flowing from one actor to the other. And so this slide comes from actually a review that our former president, Damon Dowling, did of University Business Research Collaboration. And it's breaking down the 10 top success factors in what makes those innovation collaborations, those R&D collaborations work, so that research can go into industry and have an impact. And most of those key success factors you'll see is all around the relationships. Funding comes in at number 6, IP at number 7, but mostly it's about getting those trusted personal relationships, that mutual understanding, the shared vision. And so I thought I'd share that because, from a sort of design-centric perspective, that's really what we want to create, is the new relationships that last, that sustain, and that do impactful things along the way. Next slide, please. And yeah, this is sort of the closing remarks. So that's a picture of our CEO, Dr. Hayatin Silam, who's speaking at the launch, and really a message to say, please join us if any of those missions that you see sort of resonates with yourselves, then please get in touch. We're very open. I think another thing that I wanted to say actually on the mission design side is, what's lovely about the framework is that it allows just so many entry points for people to come in and to work with you. And so I'm sure we'll be able to find some meaningful way of working with yourselves on these, but also we're open to opening our networks and working on other missions with other funders. Just one last point that I forgot to mention is around terminology. I think there's a big push around changing the narrative. I speak to engineers all the time. Engineers are very practical people, and they don't always respond well to these sort of slightly more abstract concepts around sort of missions and how you frame them. You don't need to be selling the way you do things and using that terminology to everybody. Not everybody needs to really have a good grasp of what you're doing. They need to know what your entry point is with them, what's needed from them, and then you can sort of slowly build in after that the terminology and sell the concept to them. But I think if you're looking at breaking down silos, getting those entry points and working with other stakeholders, I think it is important to sort of know that, and not everybody needs to know the whole story at the first point of contact, and talking in their language, at least at the beginning, and then building in the missions possibly as the relationships develop. So next slide, please. Yeah, exactly. So I will end there. That's my closing slide. I hope you gained something from my remarks. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Sharad. I think, you know, I would summarize that in the teamwork makes the dream work. That actually this is a people strategy, not just a structuring policy or organizing and moving around the chairs. It's actually very much a process of engagement and long-term engagement as well. So commitment is part of the narrative. You can't build a narrative and then without followers or people who are engaged in doing the work, it's not going to go anywhere. So those were really important insights. We are running about 10 minutes over time, and we do want to make sure we have a hard stop at the end of play, because it's a 3-hour workshop, and we're so delighted that so many of you have stuck around with us all the way through. So 3 hours out of someone's day and sometimes some out of people's nights. This is quite an interesting one. So because we've had so many questions in the Q&A, you know, some of the speakers have actually tried to address them actually as they've come. I'm just going to put out one question, and that was the question particularly from Jessica, who had said, you know, how long did you take to co-create missions, and managing the balance of urgency to get on with solutions and the time to define the problem right at the outset. Now, I think that can be deployed to all of our case studies. So I thought it might be worth to just say, could we have kind of one or two or less than a minute from each, just to say, how did you go about doing the co-creation of the strategy, and what would you say were your lessons about how to do it? And then what I'll promise from we will harvest all of these questions, and we will ensure that we come back to you with insights that we've brought in from our speakers. So Dan, if you want to come in first, as you were the first speaker.
Sure, and actually there's a really good detailed response to that from my colleague Jenny. If you scroll up in the chat to 2:46 p.m, you see Jenny Hueblum has described on the school food side in some detail what we did. So you can have a look at that. But in essence, I'd say we had about 2 or 3 people working on each mission area, 2 or 3 on food, 2 or 3 on mobility. We took about 6 months doing all of that co-creation, co-design, engagement, workshops, blah, 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 probably 300 organizations on food and the equivalent number on mobility. And then we took about 6 months really distilling that, co-creating prototypes, building relationships, a lot of work by Jenny and the team on the school food side, coordinating all of the national agencies into more of a systemic approach, I guess. And on the mobility side, designing and delivering those prototypes. So maybe a year, I guess, which maybe seems a lot, given we only have 9 years left for the SDGs, but then it's hard stuff. And then doing that design work up front, we're trying to build something that you could then scale quite quickly. So as you saw with the street stuff, we're trying to design something that you could then invest in and scale rapidly, having spent a bit more time up front on the research and design side. Does that help?
Fabulous, that's great. Georgie, do you want to speak a little bit to your mission setting process?
Yeah, very quick. In our case, it's all based in the startups and innovative SME that we have in our financing instrument. It's actually nowadays 3,000. And then I think that it could be 2 years. The first year is a very pedagogic year, where the concept of missions it has to be included in the mindset of everybody, and it's not a quick thing. Then several phases of contrast with the ecosystems, with the startup, with the local governments, with the experts, the sectorial associations. Not so much because we are not looking for sectors, we are looking for transforming some sectors at the same time with a new opportunity, no? So as I put in the chat, it's very similar to EDP, the entrepreneurship discovery process that was launched in RIS3 strategy, the smart specialization strategy in Europe, where it develops a methodology to share from bottom up, but also to finally decide top down these missions. So at the end, 2 years, and now we are starting the implementation this next year.
Fabulous. And Kirsten, do you want to speak to the co-creation process?
Yeah, I think as Nico already told in the chat, it's quite natural. It's almost a natural habit, whereas we forget that it's also quite difficult sometimes to do that cooperation, that co-creation part in the Netherlands. So that means that especially the new part for us is really co-create with the end user, with the citizens. And we tend to do that by going to the place where the citizen already has its fantastic initiative, which suits the needs, which meets the needs, as already pointed out in the presentation. And when you invite other people from that public-private partnerships, and you invite them, or the ministries, or whatever, you invite them to go to the place where it actually happens, and you see the initiatives that are actually very, very successful, then there changes something in the perspective of all people around. You go where the sense of urgency is felt the best, and everyone thinks like, oh, wait, is that what I'm actually doing it for? And then everyone starts to not thinking about, oh my God, actually I have my own rules and my own procedures. No, everyone starts to think, okay, how can we really fix this together? And that's a mind shift we every time and time and time and time again do. Does that answer a little bit of the question?
Absolutely, absolutely. So turning it away from being a kind of set of institutions gathering because they have to, into being a mission-oriented group or network or team. Sharad, I think that you ended with that. In terms of your process, how long would you say that took?
How long did it take? So yeah, I guess just thinking about the kind of the narrow example that I did around offshore structures and ships, it took about 4 months of really proactive outreach to get a sense of who should be in that room, and then after that as well, sort of through the project cycle or the application cycles, plugging people in to those in an adaptive way, to funding. I think about just over a year, but we are a small organization as well, so it might be with more resources, perhaps you could go a bit quicker.
Excellent, thank you so much. We're now going to move to the final section of today's bootcamp. It's been a real roller coaster ride so far, and there's been so much knowledge shared. I do want to speak to the fact that the chat has been so rich as well, that we will ensure and endeavour that we get a kind of interim paper back to you when we invite you to the next workshop, because we really want to build in the insights but also address some of these questions. And there have been some quite tactical questions for our speakers too, things like, can you share your annual governance framework, and can you share how you did this, and what is a platform? So I'll aim to try and get those things to the speakers as well. And lastly, I also wanted to mention that Sharad last year was one of our MOIN members who actually hosted a placement for our Masters in Public Administration. And because one of the upsides, and there are very few, of the COVID pandemic, is that now we are operating almost entirely as a global online platform. And so I did want to open that up to any MOIN member who wants to also do that, because we only did them in the UK last year. But if you want to be put in an expression of interest to host a placement, so that you can have some additional capacity to go deep on your mission strategy, please let me know, and we can put that into the mix as well, because I think it's an 8-week placement where students are really able to do a deeper dive and research into the work that you're doing, and it forms a very symbiotic relationship. So just let me know at a different time if that's something that is of interest to you. But now we're going to perform the magnificent task, which is putting you into breakouts. To do that, Pira is going to give you some overview of how to use the mural board, but also I've been told, please make sure you have your real name in your Zoom window, because some people have entered in using other people's links, so you may have someone else's name against you. So please rename yourself if you've got the wrong name, and then I'll pass over to Pirette to talk about the breakout groups.
Excellent, thank you very much, Rowan. So you will be assigned to 4 different thematic breakout rooms, so we can actually dig down into these challenges that are connected to missions that we've been going through today. And this is going to feed into the work that we're going to do on the 26th of January 2021, that we're going to actually work on the tools and methods to do missions in a more kind of holistic and systemic way, not to use kind of existing tools for the kind of the new and complex challenges that we're facing now. So we can't also assume that the tools and methods that we are already using or we have in place in government or in public agencies are going to actually deliver results on the missions themselves. So we want to really dig down into the kind of the challenges of working in a mission-oriented way to actually design some principles or tools and methods or a process or a solid methodology that can help you get started in a context-aware way about how to actually do mission-oriented innovation.